Okay, I want to mention the limits of knowledge. And you may have seen this before. I pulled the slide out in the first London lecture, but it gives a nice little illustration of the limits of knowledge. Okay, if you look at this look at the tiny little red spot in the center. That tiny little red spot, okay, that's us in our universe. That's our whole universe, is that little red spot, okay? Now inside the little yellowish spot that surrounds it, that's what I call our system. That's kind of part of the what we call non-physical that interacts with us. Okay, now the next one, this thing that looks kind of like a lake here, that's the larger consciousness system. And what's this? This is beyond the larger consciousness system. And you notice that's kind of in a dotted line because we really can't experience that. And why can't we experience that? Well, we're consciousness, and we're living in this little spot. We get out and interact in this little spot, and here's the larger system. And in order to experience this beyond consciousness, we would have to be beyond consciousness, and we're not. So you cannot experience out past a certain level, and there are limits to your knowledge. And I do a little analogy with that sometimes where I say that, let's say this little red spot is like a bacterium living in our intestine. And then that would be like our universe. And then this yellowish spot, it'd be like the GI tract. And then this larger consciousness system would be like your body. And this big system then here would be like your environment outside your body. Okay, now if you're a bacterium and you're in this intestine, what can you possibly know of the outside environment? What can you possibly know of things like farmers and tractors and rain and sunshine and plants and soil and animals and trucks and trains? But all of those things affect that little bacterium. You see, all of those things affect the food supply. Refrigerators, lights in the refrigerator, all those things have to do with what that bacterium deals with in its day-to-day life, which is the processing of food. So the point here, I'm trying to make this short, the point here is that we have a perspective like the bacterium. Okay? That's our perspective. We're like that little bacterium in this big system, and we can only see so far out. And after that, we can't see any further because we're limited as consciousness to not seeing beyond what's consciousness. In any case, the bad news is that not only you don't know everything, but you can't know everything. The good news is being unable to know everything does not imply that you can't know anything. One can still figure out a whole lot without knowing everything. The lesson is that just because you can't know about it directly doesn't mean that it isn't vitally important to you. Okay? All those tractors and the rain and the sunshine and the crops growing and the horses and pigs, all of them are critical to that intestinal bacterium. If it wasn't for those, that intestinal bacterium would die, would go away. So its very existence depends on the food system in which it lives. But yet it can't know anything about it. But yet its whole existence is critical and based upon it. So this is one of those areas where you have to live gracefully with uncertainty. You don't know when you say, well, what's beyond that larger consciousness system? No, you don't know. And is that larger consciousness system, is that just, is this whole larger consciousness system here, is that just maybe one cell in a bigger thing? Well, maybe. An observation that I would like to make on this is that the smaller your reality, the more convinced you are that you know everything. And that's true whether you're a 2-year-old, a teenager, a philosopher, a theologian, or a physicist. All right. The big toe that I'm describing to you is based on 2 assumptions. And one of those assumptions is this mystical assumption, if you will, that I described, in that there's some potential energy form, primordial consciousness, that exists. It's a medium capable of self-modification, self-awareness, an assumption. We have to start there. Where'd that come from? Beyond knowing. Now we can do all kinds of conjecture and make up interesting stories that please us, but there's no real fact that goes beyond that point. Same with Darwin and his cell. Where did those first cells come from? Where did that first cell come from? You need a lot of conjecture that seems reasonable, but you just don't know. There's not a lot of facts past that point. There's only so far back you can go. The second assumption on which it's based is the assumption that evolution exists. Systems with many complex potential outcomes, evolution directs and encourages change toward more profitable states. And that's true of any kind of evolving system. So you have to think of evolution in terms of a bigger concept. We think of evolution as biological, but there's, governments evolve, social systems evolve, technology evolves, architecture evolves, everything evolves. In any complex system, the monetary system, the economy, all of these are evolving things. They're all complex systems. They have interactions. They're self-changing. They move toward whatever the more profitable state of being is at the time, and however that's defined, whatever the criteria are for that. So those are the only two major assumptions made in My Big Toe. Now the fact that assumption one is if you will, a kind of a mystical assumption. In other words, it's an assumption that something exists outside of this physical reality that has these properties. That's not a weakness. That's required. You see, the subset cannot contain the information of the set. We're a subset of something larger. You cannot describe the superset from the knowledge that's contained in the subset. That's just elementary logic. So you have to, if you're going to describe the superset, you have to have at least one assumption that goes out beyond the superset. So that's the assumption, number one there. Assumption one is the assumption that's required, that's outside of the physical reality subset that allows us to come up with accurate conclusions. Okay. All the results are logically derived from just these two assumptions. In science, we call that elegant simplicity. And it's known as a hallmark of fundamental truth. It's kind of codified in science. It's called Occam's razor, which basically means if it isn't simple, if it isn't straightforward and has the minimum number of assumptions, then it's probably not fundamental. Okay, so we have a real quick summary of where we are so far. Consciousness is best modeled as a superset, self-modifying digital information system capable of computing virtual realities. The larger consciousness system evolves by lowering the entropy of the system. It lowers the entropy of the system by organizing the bits at its disposal into a more profitable configuration. Content creation, reorganization opportunities are generated by using consciousness intent applied to free will choice, to incoming experience data. That's our part. And feedback of the results of previous choice allow us to modify future choice. So that's kind of the bare bones logical sequence of what we've done so far. All right, now we want to talk about us. You have a system, it needs to evolve. It needs to do that by lowering entropy. You lower entropy by increasing complexity, increasing adaptability. It does that by breaking itself, like cell division, into pieces, having those pieces interact with each other with free will. Free will and consciousness are a max set. We've already gone through all that. So what's our, so why are we here? What's our relationship to this larger consciousness system? Well, we are part of its strategy to evolve. We're its pieces. We're parts of it. We're all related to each other. We're all connected. We're all netted together. And our job is to evolve so that the larger system can evolve. If that's our purpose, is to lower the entropy of our individual consciousness, then that defines all kinds of neat things. That'll tell you what's the difference between good and bad. What's the difference between, what separates moral values, positive moral values, negative moral values. Well, what separates them is you ask the question, how does it affect the overall entropy of the system? If it decreases it, it's good, it's moral. If it increases it, it's bad, it's immoral, you see. So things that build up, that construct, and this is moving toward love, right? These things are moral, are good, and the things that tear down and separate and pull apart, these things are not good. So that kind of defines our whole system there. And if you're really interested in ethics and morality as derived from this big toe, on the website of www.mybigtoe.com, there's a forum, and on that forum you'll find part 1 and part 2 of a moral code, if you will, ethical code that's basically derived from the principles here in this big toe. So it then lays out a whole moral code. So if you're a philosopher or you have interest in that sort of thing, I suggest that you go there. Okay, so we've answered, where does the consciousness system come from? And now this is where the individuals like we come from. Next is, where does the physical reality come from? And we've kind of talked to that. In order for us as individual chunks of consciousness to evolve, we need a virtual reality to interact in. Why do we need that? Because without the constraints of this virtual reality, we've got no traction, we've got no feedback, we've got no way to interact. And the virtual reality has to be consistent. Think of this as a kindergarten room or a first grade room. The children can't learn if everything is inconsistent. If they get told one thing one day and a different thing the next, and they can't understand, the teacher's sometimes there and sometimes not, and textbooks are sometimes there and sometimes not, and everything changes, well, this is very confusing. That's high entropy. Low entropy is where things are consistent. So we need this consistent reality, and if we did not have a virtual reality, what would we be? We'd be like that little picture we had before, those two little consciousnesses up there trading data. It would be like being in a chat room with a couple of thousand people, and no idea what's really going on. You're trading information, yes, but can you trust any of it? Is any of it right? Is it just being made up? Is it what's going on there? You see, it's hard to learn and grow. So we need this physical reality for those reasons. Without constraints, you get chaos. Evolution is very difficult without constraints. The rule set that defines our virtual physical reality, the physics, provides the constraints. And we talked about how that's evolved. That's an evolved set of constraints. So the logical sequence here is that evolution requires free will choice and change through experience. Experience requires interaction and expression of the consciousness quality. Meaningful interaction requires structure and purpose. And learning, entropy reduction, requires a structured interaction and feedback. So you see, ding, 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 that's how the logic falls out. Physical reality evolves. We're consciousness. Physical reality provides the constraints that define our choices and our experience, and our choices and experience is what defines our growth. So it gives us the opportunity. So that's why we need this virtual reality. Okay. Multiple virtual realities. Virtual means informational. Virtual means computed, right? Virtual reality relative to the actual reality where the computation's being done. Consciousness is the only thing that's fundamental. All other reality frames are virtual. Dreaming reality is another virtual reality. The dreaming reality and this reality, one is not real and the other one virtual. They're both virtual. One's not more important or significant than the other. They're both places for you to learn. They're both environments in which you can experience. You can experience different things in different ways in both realities. You can explore and you can be challenged in different ways in both realities, but they're all learning experiences. They're all growing experiences. So what that means is that we, as consciousness, we work all day and we work all night. So it's work, 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 because as you sleep, you're experiencing, you're learning, you're growing. And as you're awake, you're experiencing, you're learning, you're growing. So it's challenges. You learn from both. It doesn't actually make sense to call some realities non-physical and some physical. It's all the same. A reality appears to be physical if you're in it. So now that we're awake, we're in this reality, then this is our physical reality. We're dreaming and we're in that dream reality, that's our physical reality. It has a different physics. You can fly in your dreams. Can't fly here. It's a different rule set, but that's our physical reality. And this physical reality is gone. When we're dreaming, we're not aware of this reality. So you see, whatever reality you're in is defined as your physical reality. So dreams, out-of-body experiences, where you go when you die, Bob Monroe had locale 1, 2, and 3, various reality types. All of those things are just different virtual realities. Virtual realities are created to generate personal experience. Evolution of the individual requires personal experience. Okay? Effective evolution of the system, or the larger consciousness system, requires evolution of the individual. Thus, the system evolves virtual realities for the use of its subsets, us. So we are characters in a virtual reality, making characters in a virtual reality. Right, here we are in a virtual reality, and what are we doing? We're making virtual realities. You know, we're doing The Sims and WoW, that sort of thing. And one day, when our computers become conscious, one day we will have conscious computers. Those computers may make virtual realities within the virtual reality, you see? So what is this looking like? You know, we have a virtual reality inside a virtual reality inside a virtual reality. This is a fractal process. Okay, we have fractal process. Each piece of it contains the information or the seed or the processes of the whole, but it's not a geometric fractal. Geometric fractal, you take a little design like a triangle or a little equation, and you keep repeating that over and over and building different scales, and you can build up these very elaborate and beautiful designs. Actually, you can build up things that look like nature, trees and skies and mountains, because this is a fractal reality. It's a virtual reality, but it's built up out of a fractal process. And you can see you have reality inside a reality. We're all chips off us, our individual consciousness. We're just the next step down in a fractal process from the one consciousness. We're just a piece of that same thing, and we have all the attributes that it has, except we're small. See, we're a subset. Right. Data stream is to each participating consciousness. Everyone gets their own personal data stream. Here's how the kind of the breakouts between the WoW or the Sims and our virtual reality is that in the Sims game, the yellow words are basically the computing game, and the orange words are basically the PMR game, the physical matter reality game. In the computer game, you have the characters in the game setting. In our reality, you have us, the body, and our environment. You have the server in the computer game, and then you have the larger consciousness system in this realities game. Okay, the local computer stores character content, but in ours, it's the content, the brain function, is really stored in consciousness. Your brain doesn't store anything. We think of our brain has all this data in it. That's not really the case. The brain doesn't have all this data in it. It just seems that way to us from our belief in an objective reality, and it appears that way because we're kind of looking at it backwards. Consciousness contains the data. That's where your data is. Your experience data that defines you is in consciousness. You are consciousness. There is no such thing as a brain. It's a virtual brain, just like it's a virtual body. That brain and that body are just how you interpret the data. The brain never has to be rendered unless somebody splits open your skull. It's just assumed, and you just act as if you had one. Most of the time. Couldn't help that. So, you know, it's the same with the Sims characters. As those Sims walk around, right? They don't have brains, right? They're just virtual characters. Well, they do things for reasons. If you were a Sim character in that game and that was your reality, you would assume that people do things because they had brains. And if in the Sims game you had a Sims brain doctor, when that Sims brain doctor cut open a Sims character's head, what would you find in it? A brain, right? It would have to render the brain because now you opened it for the measurement, so you'd have to find a brain in there. But otherwise, you just act as if it had a brain because that's the way the realities work. So we're like that too. So the brain, just like our body, represents the constraints on our virtual reality game. It represents the rule set. It was the rule set in that big digital bang that evolved into this virtual reality, right? It's all part of that big digital bang. It all ran out in this simulation. So here we have this simulation that's because of the rule set. So because we have these bodies, we have this brain, and all that's simulated in this rule set, that creates our virtual reality. That's the limits. We can't go past those limits, so we can't contain anything more in our brains than what this virtual reality simulation says we can. It's the limiting factor. So it defines what we can and cannot do based on the rule set, because any virtual reality has to abide by its rule set. Otherwise, it's a funhouse reality. You need a rule set for consistency. So our brain doesn't store information. It doesn't process information. It sets limits on what can be stored and processed. So you have a brain injury, somebody bangs you over the head and now your brain is damaged, or you have a stroke and your brain is damaged, you can't maybe remember as much. You lose memory. You can't do math problems like you used to do. Your brain now is more limited. That's because the brain damage, according to the rule set, constrains what the brain can do. And you, as consciousness, in this virtual reality, can't do anything the rule set doesn't support. You see? So that's the way this works. Again, the big difference between the WoW and the Sims is that they have a programmed reality and we have an evolved one. Ours is much more complicated, much more detailed and complex. All right, past, present, and future. This is the mechanics of how the system works. You have a virtual reality, and in order to have this virtual reality, the engine that generates this virtual reality has to know what's going to happen next. It's not very efficient to keep surprising it, so it has to figure everything up in the next delta t. It has looked ahead to see what's probable, what's likely. That way it can get ready, and it provides a nice feedback system for us, and our whole reality is based on it. So we have a future probable reality, and the way that works is that the computer says, all right, here we are in the present. Now, what's the most probable thing that's going to happen next? And then it looks at the system and says, well, what are all the things that could happen next? Okay? And what's the probability of all of the things that are going to happen next? So here are all the possibilities. Here's all the probability of the possibilities. And now what is the highest probability? Okay, and then it says, given that that's true, okay, now that's just a guess based on what the system thinks is going to be probable. That's just a guess, but the time increments are only 10 to the minus 44 seconds apart. So we're only guessing 10 to the minus 44 seconds into the future. See, that's a pretty good guess, right? That's not too hard to guess. Things don't change that fast. So we're guessing at a tiny little increment into the future. So then it says, well, given that that's true, what's the next delta t time increment going to look like? What's it? What are all the things that we think could happen given that what we said happened in the next one? Given that that's true, what's going to be the one after that? And given that that's true, what's going to be in the one after that? And it keeps working out delta t at a time until it has this future probability database, which is all the possibilities and their probability of happening. Each one's based on the last one being correct, which means if you have errors, those errors propagate. Now you have error propagating, out through all those. So you can only do that so far out before it gets silly because there's so much error out there that you kind of quit. So it only goes as far as is reasonable. Well, that's the way the system works. So everything that's going to happen, all the possibilities are sitting there in this probable future database. Now here we are in the present and we make a choice. When we make a choice, we grab one of those possibilities and say, that's our choice. Okay, now that's our choice in the present. We only act and we only have free will in the present. We just live in this little slice of time which is right in the middle between the future and the past. And it's just an instant. We live in the moment. And in that moment, we make all of our choices. And we grab one of those probabilities. Okay, so that's the way it works. So when we have that double slit experiment and there's a photon out there someplace, then it's just probability. It's in the future. We haven't measured it yet. We haven't seen it yet. So it's just probability. And then when we do measure it, we say, there it is. Just went through this slit. Okay, there it is. It becomes a particle and it hits in a little spot right behind the slit. You see, because it was future probability like everything else. Like everything in our existence is future probability. Okay, so that's how the system works. Now after you have all this future probability, you have the present where you make your choices. Then you have the historical database, which takes that future database and just moves it to the past because time's gone by now. Okay, we've had that delta t. Everything that we chose and did is part of our history thread. If we look at all those delta t's of all the choices we made, collectively made, all the conscious critters here in the game, then that's our history. That's what will show up in the history books if the history books were accurate. And everything that we could have done but didn't do, That's the unactualized past. Okay, that's also in the database. And all the probabilities that we would have done them. See, all the probabilities stay with it. So there we are. Now we can visit those databases. We can go into the future probable database and see what's likely to happen. We can use our intent to change the likelihood of that happening. We can go into the past databases, the actualized or the unactualized. We go into the actualized, then it's basically our history thread, and we can go look, we can see what's going on. And now we interact there like it was, like we were there. It's like a movie where you can join into the movie. You can become a part of it. You can go in there and you can ask characters and you can go to a time and walk up to Thomas Jefferson or walk up to King Louis the 14th or something and ask him a question, and you'll get an answer. And the answer will be the most probable answer that you would get, if that's what your intent is. And then you can follow that sequence up. So it's all there, and it's a great library resource where you get to step into the book and you get to interact with the characters. But they're all just probability models. But then on the other hand, so are you. You're just a probability model. It's what you are. Your data, your rules, your content, your experience, your history, everything you've ever done, thought, felt in any of your incarnations are all tied up into that's your history file, if you like. That's you. And what makes you different right here than in the future or in the past databases, here you have a free will. When you enter into a virtual reality, you enter into a reality that has choice and decision space. And where you have choice and decision space, because you are a consciousness, you have free will. The free will exists only here in the present. In those databases, you're just data. It's just information, and you're just a piece of the larger consciousness system. You're just data in the file of the big mainframe, if you will. So you're just a piece of the larger consciousness system. There you don't have free will because it's just a data file. You don't need free will. You're part of the larger system, and the larger system has free will. It's like, your ears, do they have free will? Well, no, they're just part of a larger system that has free will. You say your ears don't go off and make decisions, certainly not without consulting you, but they don't have independent free will because they're just a part of you, and you have the free will. That's the way you are when you're in the future probable or in the past. It's just you, a model of you, your data, your history, your experience, your feelings, your ego, your fears, your beliefs, everything that makes you you, and it's just there, and it's a model. Now, there's really not all these separate models of you in every instance of all the possibilities could happen. It's just one model of you. It just has lots of instances of it that are in the, that are used in those various capacities. So that's what's in these historical and future databases, models of all these people. So if King Henry the 14th, then you run into a model of him. But it is a very detailed model of him. And the responses you get in interacting with him, if it is your intent that they be that way, that will be the most likely. And that will change something, and then you can see what else is most likely. So as you go into those events and change things, you can follow a most likely sequence, all the way through all the probabilities. So you can back into the historical database and say, okay, let's see, what would life be like now if Hitler had won World War II? Where would we be? What would we be doing? What would life be like? And you can follow that right up scene by scene, and if you want to go right down into the streets of Calgary and see what difference it made in those streets, you can do that. You see, you can follow that history right on out, and that will be following the probable reality if that had happened. So you can ask questions. It's a wonderful resource, the best library you'll ever find. And it's interactive, and it's personal. Okay, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily what would have happened. It just means that's the most probable thing that would have happened. All of us have that right, because we have free will, of doing things that are unexpected. So when we do something unexpected, we thought that maybe what we would do next would be this, and that's what the system guessed was be the next thing, but we do that instead. Well, that's just like humans to do that. And when that happens, the system then has to recompute, not everything, but just the things that are downstream that are dependent upon that action. So that's all it has to do is compute its errors. But that's not really too hard because most people are very predictable, particularly at the 10 to the minus 44 seconds at a time. So that's the way the system works. Now when we see an aura, what are we seeing? Our intent goes to the larger conscious system and says, I want to see the health data on Susie Q. And out comes health data on Susie Q, and we see it as maybe what do they call it, the etheric aura around Susie Q, because that's the format we want it in. Okay, it's just data. When we go out of body and we're doing a near Earth, I think Bob called that locale 1, it's because we're getting that out of the database. That's data from the database. That's why it's a little odd sometimes. You know, sometimes you do that out of body and you go through your house and you know that there's a flower vase sitting on a stand over here, but yet you find it sitting someplace else. It's not quite always exactly right. Well, the database isn't perfect. This computer isn't perfect. It's real, and some things are more important than others. And when it collects the data, it doesn't necessarily collect every possibility. That would be too much. It collects what it thinks is the most important data based on the probability of what the most important data will be. So sometimes things in that world get a little out of whack because it's just a database. Okay, so it's not a perfect database, but it's a near perfect database. And you say, well, that's the history database, but what happens if we go out of body in the present time? Well, it's pretty close to a present database in the sense that it's only 1 times 10 to the minus 44 seconds behind. You see the present moment. So it is a current database. That's too small a difference for you to notice. So that's where these things, past lives, people that do past lives regressions and they go into past lives, they're just getting into these databases. And you'll find out that in this database, you can make it output the data in any way you want, in any form that you want. So if the way you'd like to make the data output of someone's emotional body is by a light around them that has certain colors in it that means something to you, that's the way you'll get it. If you'd like it plotted on a graph, that's the way you'll get it. Okay? So these things all have their sources in data. And as they relate to us, they all have sources in the probable future, precognitive dreams, in the past, actualized, history thread, or in the unactualized. But now you have to realize that it's your intent is the way you query the database. It's your intent, and that intent does everything. That intent sets up what information you get, that intent sets up the output, and if that intent is fuzzy, what you get back is fuzzy. If any database is like that, you go up to Google and put love and say, enter, and you get 6 million results back, right? You're looking for something in particular, but you can't find it. You get all this garbage back. Well, it's the same way here. If your intent's fuzzy, what you get back's fuzzy. If you're not sure where you're going or what you want to see or the data you get exactly, then you get a random slur of all the stuff that might have filled your intent. So if you have a fuzzy intent, you get all kinds of stuff back that's not necessarily what you wanted. So intent is critical, that you know exactly what you want, where you're going. And if you don't know that there is such databases, your intent tends to be pretty fuzzy and nonspecific. That's why sometimes you end up precognitive, sometimes you're looking at the future, sometimes you're in a past. Sometimes that past doesn't work out because you're in the unactualized past rather than the actualized past because you don't know the difference. So it's very fuzzy unless you know where you're going. So that's kind of the structure of how all that works. All right, here's a picture of that probable reality surface. Basically, this is just a cartoon that shows you that these peaks going up, these little spikes going up are probability, and time goes out from the center of this disk out in all directions. All the radii come out in centers of their time. So the closer you get into the center, the closer you get into the time now, which is t equals 0 at the center, then the probabilities get a whole lot bigger, because the closer you get, the more likely it is that you know what's going to happen. So the probability of something happening is big. But occasionally, you get some things like this one. It's a pretty high probability, or this one, and it's pretty far out. And those are things that are good prognostications, right? Those are things that are very likely to happen even if it's years from now. And sometimes you get things like this that are spread in one direction but not spread too much in the other. There's just all sorts of things, but as you get closer to the center, you get a lot of high peaks, things get more and more likely. Now you can affect these peaks, what the probability is, with your intent. All right. Now let's talk more about the mechanics. This little cartoon. That's Uncle Tom building his reality out of ones and zeros. All these cartoons were done for me by Judy Johnson. I should give her credit for them. She saw one of my briefings once. It was one that was done in Asheville, and she told me that my briefing was dull visually and that she would like to fix that. And I said, please go ahead. So now I have these lovely, lovely pictures. A picture of Einstein you saw, and all of them were done by this one artist. Now we're going to talk about rendering virtual realities. You know, in a virtual reality game like World of Warcraft, you look around a corner, you change your direction of vision, and you can actually see the computer filling in the background for you. You see trees springing up, mountains springing up in front of you. Well, ours works the same way. Things that you are not looking at are not rendered to you. Okay, right now, the clock in the back of the room is being rendered to me because I can see it. It's not being rendered to you. This back wall is being rendered to you. It's not being rendered to me. Now, that doesn't mean that things disappear when you don't look at them, because things were never there in the first place. They were just data. Don't get trapped into the belief that things actually existed to begin with. It's just data, and we all have our own independent data stream. Let's talk about a tree in the park at 3 a.m. in the morning. If you got a park and there's a tree in it, let's say this is in a small town and everybody goes to bed. Nobody's going through the town. Nobody's in the park. Well, what happens? We think the tree disappears? No. There never really was a tree there. All there was the probability of a tree that got rendered to those people who probably could see it. You see, it was all individual. So it's not that things disappear when you don't look at them. It's just you have this multiplayer reality, and things are probable or not probable. And once something comes into this reality, it has to be continuous, just like the particle. Once it's a particle, it has to act like a particle. Okay. So when you go to bed at night, you no longer have that tree rendered into your data stream. When you get up and look out the window, it gets rendered into your data stream, and it gets rendered so quickly that you don't see it pop up into the park like you do in a World of Warcraft. It's so fast that it's just there. Okay. Now let's say that tree, nobody's ever really climbed to the very tippy top of that tree because it's so big and it's not allowed to climb in. There's a big sign on it that says, stay off the tree. So what is there, a little bump up there on one of those, say somewhere up near the top of that tree? Is there a little bump? Well, that's undefined. Nobody knows. Nobody's been up there. If you climb up that tree and take a measurement, you will either get a bump or not based on the probability of a bump being there. And let's say that the probability is just as likely that it's not there that it is. Then you'll go into a random pull, a random selection, a random draw out of a probability distribution, and you either get a bump or you won't, you see, and it'll define that bump. Now, after you've gone up there and looked at it, then now it's in this reality. Anybody else comes up behind you, they'll see what you saw, because what you saw brings the data here. Okay. Now, let's say you haven't been up in that tree for a very long time and you've really forgotten what was up there. Somebody else goes up there, they get a random draw. May or may not be a bump there because now that information went away. Okay, see how that works? I keep coming back to this virtual reality, but I know that's hard to understand, but hopefully it'll sink in slowly. Okay, future exists in probability, remains that way, unrendered until required by gameplay. Some player requires the data, makes a measurement. Okay, the larger consciousness system knows what's likely, what's possible, and what's important. The set of possibilities are represented statistically. So things don't disappear, they're really not there. This physical reality doesn't exist, it's just data. You're starting to get the sense of this virtual reality, how it works? Okay, if you believe that the universe is in a specific state at this instant, then I would call that a scientific belief. When the astrophysicist looks out at the universe with his instruments, the future probable universe may be in any one of, probably 1 million states. because there's a lot of uncertainty in there in that universe that we haven't looked at before. Okay, 1 million of those states might be nearly equal probability, some quite different than others. When he makes his measurement, when he snaps his picture or takes his data from his telescope, he gets one of them. And after that, that's the way our reality is for that part of the universe. So the universe's probability function, at least the part of the probability function that he was measuring, collapses to a given physical state. And now that part of that universe is defined, becomes part of our historical record, and everybody else will see that way too. The same as the wave function for the particle. So you see, measuring a big chunk of outer space that's billions of light years wide and long, this huge thing, works exactly like that little photon or like that electron. It works the same way. It's just probable reality until it's measured, until the data comes into this reality, and then it's a part of our reality frame. So that's why particles are probability distributions. So is the universe. It's a probability distribution until it gets measured. So it's not just for little things, it's for everything. Okay, what about rendering psi effects? You might say, don't they violate the rule set? And the answer is generally no, they don't violate the rule set. The rule set's more open than you think. The rule set has nothing to do with objective causality. It represents the entanglement of uncertainty with the measurement of psi effects. That's called the psi uncertainty principle. You can force your virtual physical reality to exceed the limits and functions of its defining rule set, but only if sufficient uncertainty remains in the system. Okay, so there must always be plausible deniability by outsiders that the rule set was actually busted. That's why we were talking on Friday that you can modify those distributions for the radioactive decays, but you can only modify them within the natural uncertainty. Okay, nature of a virtual reality. Does oxygen need to be rendered to the characters of World of Warcraft or The Sims to breathe? Of course not. They're virtual. Does it need to be rendered for us to breathe? Of course not. We're virtual. Okay. How is it that we breathe? It's probable. Whenever we inhale, we take a measurement. If the probability is that there's oxygen here, then we keep on going as if it was. But it doesn't need to be rendered. And if it doesn't need to be rendered, it doesn't need to exist here for us now. If we go get a microscope or something that can see an oxygen molecule, then it needs to be rendered. So we function like the World of Warcraft characters. We function based on what we need to do. In other words, we need to breathe, so we breathe because it's probable. When something's rendered, it has to be consistent historically with the existing data. 1, 2, consistent causally with the rule set. These are the only 2 criteria. Basically, these are criteria that say we don't live in a funhouse reality. Things have to be consistent here. You can't have this data that's an observed, measured fact conflicting with this data that's an observed, measured fact. They can't conflict. That's basically what the rule says. We have to abide by the rule set, and we have to have historical consistency. Okay? Anything outside of those rules is possible, can happen here. So anytime there's many things, many solutions to a single problem, then how do you pick which one? Well, that is where we take our random draw from. Okay, and we just pick one. And that's it. We live with it after that. I'm going to do the tree falls in the woods thing, but we're going to take it a little further than we did the last time. So our virtual reality is just a more detailed and sophisticated because it evolved rather than it's programmed. Our sense of physical realness is an illusion, just as Bohr said. He says, if you think things are really physically out there, then you just don't understand quantum mechanics. They're not really out there. What's probable according to our rule set is enforced. Consistency is required. Molecules don't need to be rendered unless somebody's looking at them. Okay, let's do the tree falls in the woods thing. The tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? And of course it's no, it's because it's a virtual woods, virtual trees, and a virtual reality. And the way we stated this yesterday was that somebody walks into a woods, they look, take a measurement. When they take a measurement, they get what's probable. And in this case, what's probable is a wobbly tree, dead, but still standing. They go away, come back 5 years later, what they get is a dead tree lying on the ground. Did it fall? No. No need to fall. It only falls if it's an objective reality. It was probable that it was a dead tree. It was probable that it was lying on the ground 5 years later. That's what it gets, okay? Now, we said that the guy comes out of the woods, gets eaten by a bear, somebody else walks into the woods, do they necessarily see the same dead tree? No, because that was just probable, but now there's no data to conflict with something different. If there's no data to conflict with something different, then another choice can be taken. Okay, so you may get something else. Okay, now what if there were squirrels living in that tree? When the guy came in, would he have to find that tree because there were squirrels in that woods? Yes, of course, squirrels are conscious creatures. The squirrels are in that woods, they're players. Everything that's conscious is a player in this game. So if the squirrels had their nests in that tree, then that guy walked in, the probability would be that that dead tree was standing there because the squirrels had already brought that into the reality frame, you see. So where does this reach? How about the bugs? Well, then we have to define, what's a consciousness? A consciousness is some entity that has a finite decision space. If you can actually make choices, if you have an array of choices that you can make and you can say, well, okay, I got these 3 things I can do and I'll do that one. You have free will, you're conscious. In that case, you're a player in the game. If you have a 0 decision space, there's lots of things that have 0 decision space. A rock has 0 decision space. Tree probably has 0 decision space. Okay? It can't make decisions, then it doesn't have what we're defining as consciousness. All right? So the size of your decision space has to do with the size of your reality. As you grow up, your reality gets bigger and bigger. And right now, your reality is just here in this part of this physical universe. Eventually, your reality goes beyond that. It consumes that, it consumes the dream reality, and consumes maybe 4 or 5 other reality systems. The bigger your reality gets, the more decision space you have, the more opportunity you have to grow up. The more information you get, the better you understand. So all of us don't have the same decision space. It's personal, it's individual, it's subjective, just like free will. Let's say the guy goes into the woods, he sees that dead tree there. He leaves, he comes back 3 weeks later. He walks into that woods again, but he doesn't really remember for sure whether there's a dead tree there or not. His memory's real foggy. He thought, well, maybe I sort of remembered something over there, but I'm not sure. Must he still get that dead tree? Not necessarily, as long as what he gets is within the uncertainty of the situation, you see. If he's uncertain, then there may be a live tree sitting there, and he'd say, well, I thought I remembered a dead one, but I guess not, I really don't know. You see, because of the amount of uncertainty is what defines what must or must not come in here. If there's data here, you can't conflict with it. But if the data here is uncertain, then you can conflict with it to some amount. Now, he couldn't walk in there and instead of having that dead tree, find a stack of 20 dead trees on top of each other, you see, because that would be something you couldn't forget. That would be very odd. So he's not going to get anything that's outside of the plausible uncertainty. He's bounded by that. So when the system has multiple solutions, the system has an ability to produce many different things. All right. This is just going to be a quick series of things that will point out a little bit about how we see the world. Here's a picture of you. You're the happy face in the middle. That's us. Everything to us in our world is either physical, it's physical and it's external. So here we see things that are other people, symbols for other people, these other little faces. and here's stuff and other stuff. And that's the way we see the world. There's us, and there's everything that's outside of us. That's the world, okay? We try to conceptualize that we're a part of the larger consciousness system, that we're one with all it is. We try to do that, and this is what we get. There's the one in the middle, and there's us up on top on a little stick. We can't see ourselves as one. We always have to see ourselves as somehow separate. Otherwise, it wouldn't be ourselves, would it? You see? That's our cultural beliefs. We see ourselves, and then there's other, and other out here to the sides. But there we are up on the stick, and there's the one, and we say, oh yes, we're all connected to the one, but we're connected by this little stick, but we're still our individual selves sitting up on top of the stick. All right, so next, we're going to say, well, okay, we are trying to be your one with your higher self or oversoul, but you still need to be separate. So you see yourself as that one connected to the higher self up there on the little stick with other incarnations around. You're connected, but you still separate yourself. All right, here is more the way it actually is. This is kind of the larger consciousness system. And here is everybody else. And if you look at this and you say, oh, okay, that one's me over there. Now you're separating yourself again. It's not like that. We're all just a piece of this same thing. Okay, you draw the separating lines in your conceptualization of reality because you cannot imagine a thing that is not distinct and spatially and functionally separate from yourself. In your mind, existence requires separateness. That's a belief, a cultural belief. That's a virtual reality belief. This virtual reality gives us this idea of separateness. Okay, you have individuality in the form of individual history data. Okay, you're only one that have had your experience. That's individual, that's you. Continuity of growth, lowering of entropy from experience packet to experience packet, that means lifetime to lifetime, is required for cumulative learning, but you are not a separate thing. You are an evolving collection of experience data, rules, patterns, memory, and perhaps some processing capability with a specific level of entropy that you're trying to decrease. Experience packet by experience packet. You're a distributed cell of the larger consciousness system. Now for a minute, think about a computer file on your computer. You have a Word document, it's on your computer. Where is it actually? Do you think it's a little clump of ones and zeros in some corner of your hard drive? It is not. Those ones and zeros for that file are spread all over that hard drive. They're all over the place. Okay. There's no reason to make yourself this separate little piece. Just a part of the larger consciousness system. Okay, that model, your data set, that model of you that we talked about, representing you in the database, doesn't have free will. Data sets don't need free will, okay? They're one with the larger consciousness system, and the larger consciousness system has free will. Now, we just kind of mentioned this. To evolve that data set further, the larger consciousness system must start with the capability of you. That's what we call the IUOC, the individuated unit of consciousness. Your history, your evolution, your data set, and then constrain that data to experience only what a specific VR rule set allows. That is, you're placed as a specific individual with free will in a VR where you have the opportunity to evolve by making choices with a free will. That's where you have the free will. The free will and consciousness comes to you as a result of the decision space generated within the experiential virtual reality. If your individuated unit of consciousness is simultaneously in a different VR than you, then it may also have free will and make choices and interact with you. Okay, that's the way this system works. You talk about guides. All of us kind of have guides. We have non-physical entities. I shouldn't say all of us. Many of us do that we've interacted with for a long, long time, many years. What are those guides? They're just another part of this larger consciousness system. And where do they come from? Well, they're not little beings that just hover around us, in a cloud over our heads watching our every motion. I mean, what a boring job would that be? How could you stand to be a guide and all you did was hover over somebody and wait for him to do something, right? I mean, how could you stand that? It's impossible. A guide is our interface to the larger consciousness system. When we have questions, we put the questions out. When we interact, we get this help. It's our interaction with the larger consciousness system. And is it consistent? Sure, you have a consistent interface. Does it have a sense of humor? Does it have personality? Of course. Interface can have a sense of humor and a personality. It's a being just like you are. It's virtual. It pops up out of that larger consciousness system whenever it's needed. And when it's not needed, it goes back into that larger consciousness system, just like your Word document. When you need it, you click on it, and all those little ones and zeros from all over the hard drive come together, and you get a Word document. When you say save, you close it, it all gets spread all back over the hard drive again. Different place. You see, so it works the same kind of way. If you need a guide, one bubbles up. But the term guide simply represents a metaphor in your mind. The guide is one form of information interface to the larger consciousness system. Your intuition is another form of that interface. You interpret guide as a separate being because it's your habit of thinking that anything you communicate with is, of course, a being. And if it's a being, your habit of thinking is that the being's sort of like you. Has a head and shoulders, feet, arms, legs, all those kinds of things. So we make this interface into a being because that's our metaphor for something that communicates with us. It just bubbles up out of the larger conscious system when we need it. We get bubbled up out of the larger conscious system too, in the same way. And then we get dropped in this virtual reality, a little free will, gives us decision space, and now we try to grow up, become love, lower the entropy of our consciousness. So you see how this works? Now over here, we have all of these things that are all surrounded one by the other. We have free will awareness units. We have the body in the middle. We have higher self, oversoul, individuated unit of consciousness, and then we have the larger conscious system out in the end. These all have dotted lines in them. They're all metaphors. They're all just metaphors. These are a way we structure this model so that we can talk about it. These are a way we structure the information. You see, we structure it into all these pieces because then we can break it into pieces that we can talk about. We can share these metaphors. We talk about, I had a guide and we interact like this and it tells me this and tells me that, and we interact and we can communicate about it. This is really what the picture looks like, except it doesn't have all these little individual happy faces on it. It's all just one thing. We really are one. The Buddha was right when he said we are all one. The one is a larger consciousness system that is evolving. It's a real system. It's a finite system. It's evolving. It's trying to evolve, and we are part of its strategy to do that. We're just a piece of it. So instead of imposing our beliefs and physical reality structure on the largest consciousness system, making guides that are people and float above us and so on, let those PMR-generated beliefs and assumptions go and let your guides form up out of the larger system on demand, just as you form up out of the larger system on demand to participate in this virtual reality. Consciousness experiencing virtual reality generated by consciousness. That's what we are. Conscious intent changes the probabilities. We've been talking about that. You know of people who talk to their plants, people who love their plants. We call them people with green thumbs, right? Because the plants grow really well for them. Why? Because their conscious intent is a very positive one for that plant. They're connected with that plant. Their conscious intent changes the probable reality of the condition of that plant, and the plants thrive under them. People who don't care much about their plants, or the plant's just something else that they have to water sometimes, they don't do very well because they don't help modify the future probability concerning that plant. Positive thinking, prayer, law of attraction, the raising and lowering the pH, pair labs, biasing random number, Geiger counter counts, the Emoto freezing the crystals. All of these things have to do with conscious intent modifying future probable reality. Why doesn't it always work? Why are there inconsistencies? Why is it sometimes these things work, sometimes your positive thinking seems to fail you? You can say, well, I was very positive about it, but it just didn't happen anyway. Well, there's several reasons for that. Okay, probability is associated with uncertainty. Okay, if you have less uncertainty, you have narrow probability curves. your curves tend to look like this. That's a curve, that's something that might happen. That's an event with very little uncertainty. Okay, here are all the various things that can happen. These are probability of a random draw selecting a specific state of thing 1. Here's a probability of thing 1, and we see that if we're going to reach in there and grab a probability, what are we going to get? We're going to get F, right? That's the state that it's going to be in. It's going to be in state F. It's not going to be any of the others because they're all 0. So that's the only state that has any non-zero probability. Okay, that's something in which there is very little uncertainty. Okay, it's very certain that that is what it is. Now down here's a curve. Let's look at this curve and see there's a lot more uncertainty here. And yeah, it could be F, it could be G, it could be E, it really could be H. It could be a lot of those things, and they're not all that different in their probability. Now I want to give you an idea how this random selection works, because we talk about, well, you just reach up and you take a random selection out of the distribution. What am I talking about? Random selection works like a raffle. Let's take this curve that we're talking about. Okay, if we say that, see, probability distributions are just ratios. So if this is a probability distribution, it goes to 1. The probabilities are always between 0 and 1. But that's just a ratio. You can multiply all the probabilities by 100, and now they're between whatever your lowest number is and 100. You see, so let's say that the top of this peak is 100. So then F is, say, 99 or 98, and G is 97, and H is 85, and I is 43, and this is 20, and that's 0. Okay, now you take, like, those numbers were like a raffle ticket in a hat. So here I'm going to put 99 Fs in the hat. I'm going to write 99, I'm going to write F, 99 pieces of paper, throw them in the hat. Here I'm going to write, 95 Gs, put those in the hat. Here I'm going to write, 10 Js and put those in the hat, and so on. So when I'm done, I have all of this from A through K. Each one of those has a certain number of tabs of paper with those letters on it in the hat. Shake them all up, make them random, and then I reach in and I take one out. That's what I mean by taking a random selection from the probability distribution. That's what that means. Well, what that means here, the probability of getting an A over here, which maybe is a 1, well, that's 1, not 1 out of 100, but that's 1 out of, probably if you sum all the tags you have in the hat with letters on them, about 450 with those numbers. Okay, so you got to have 450 pieces of paper in a hat with a letter on them. And chances are you're going to get an E, an F, or a G, because that's what most of them are. Out of those 450, there's only one A. One little piece of paper has an A on it. So it's not likely. It's just 1 in 450 is going to grab out an A, you see. So that's what, this is called the fat part of the curve, and these are the tails of the probability. So when you take random distribution, and so you pull a number out from the tail of the distribution, these are the tails, and that's what's just referred to as the fat part of the curve. So that's what I mean by pulling the distribution out. So you look at a distribution like here we have 100 Fs and 0 everything else. Well, you reach into that hat, you shake it up, and you pull out, what are you going to get? You'll pull out an F, right? That's the only thing that's in there. So that's very little uncertainty. This is more normal. Now, why we said when we started this is why doesn't it work sometimes? Well, sometimes your probabilities change. Sometimes they skew. Sometimes you get a distribution like this one, okay? Sometimes it looks like that. It's not this nice even thing. And you have very little probability from here down, but you have a whole lot of probability from there over. Basically, probability now becomes area under the curve. So that's why, because here you are, you've been positive, you put your positive thinking, and there's a whole bunch of different things that could happen, and you reach into the distribution and you pull one out, and oh, you didn't get the one you wanted. You see, it doesn't always work for you. And the system is just designed that way. And it's not like, well, it didn't work, I didn't do it right, I need to try harder next time. Well, maybe that's true. You might be able to do better and you may be able to try harder. But the point is, it's not always going to work because this is a probabilistic statistical system. It's not an objective system, and you can't make it objective in your manipulation of the larger consciousness system's feedback any more than it's objective in any other way. You reach up into that probability distribution, you can just get something other than what you want or what you expect, because that's the way it is. You don't always get the one you want. All right, so now that's why it doesn't always work. The system's made so that it doesn't always work. But it'll work more often if you put your intent to raise that probability. So let's say you have an intent, and what your intent is to get C. So let's say that this is the way it was before. You put your intent into it, and you change that probability distribution like that, like the dotted one. Now that's the new probability distribution because of your intent. You've worked on it for a couple of weeks now with the intent that really C is the outcome you want to see. Maybe C is good health. Maybe that's a tumor, not being cancerous, but being benign. So you work on that, and that probability distribution changes. And then when it comes time to make the measurement and do the biopsy, you go in, and guess what you do? You take a random selection under this curve. Well, now you've made it a lot more likely to get a C than it would have been otherwise. Otherwise, that C was down here at, maybe 10 out of 450. Now, that C has a lot more probability, but it's not 1. You might not pick a C. Even with this distribution, you could easily pick a D or an E or an F or something else, you see? So that's why it doesn't always work. So in an objective world, the objective folks, the scientists say, this stuff's all nonsense because it isn't repeatable. See, in an objective reality, that's part of the scientific method. It's got to be repeatable. Well, it's not repeatable. This is not an objective reality. It's a probabilistic statistical reality. It doesn't always happen the same way twice. You're taking random draws from distributions. You can modify the distribution, but that doesn't give you a 100% chance of making the probability come out the way you want. So that's how that works. Okay, back to the slide we had before this. Consciousness, experience of virtual reality generated by consciousness. Okay, that's why it doesn't always work. Okay, you are both the creator and the experiencer. Okay, how is it? You've probably heard this. We create our own reality, right? That's a phrase that you'll hear a whole lot. Well, how is it that we create our own reality? Obviously, we don't create all of it, or we'd all be, handsome, beautiful, and rich, right? If we created our own reality. So we're not doing that. So what is it that we get to create? What we get to create is, one way is by our interpretation. We get the data. We create our reality because this reality is just what we interpret it to be. That's why you get some people who are pessimists and the glass is always half empty. And you get optimists and the glass is always half full. They get the same data, but they interpret it two different ways. So one way we create our reality is the way we interpret the data, which has to do with our beliefs and fears and history and all of our experiences. The second way that we do that is we have this feedback. We get to modify the probable realities. So we can help create our own reality by being positive, by sending out love, by caring, good things. That tends to make our life have a higher probability of being positive and good and happy, you see, because that's the kind of people we are. That's the kind of energy that goes out. That's the way we bias the probability distributions in our favor. Okay, so that's another way that we do that. Another way that we create our own reality is that the choices we make is what defines what choices we get to make next. Remember, it's like the path, like the social Brownian motion. The fact that you made this choice now alters the choices that you have. Had you made a different choice, you'd have a different set of choices than because you made this choice. So every time you make a choice, you begin to create your own reality by modifying your decision space. So we have a lot of power over our own reality. There's a lot of ways that we do make it, but it's a multiplayer game, and you've got all these other players that are also doing the same sort of thing, you see, and we have to interact with them. So we can't just make everything be the way we want it. Even when we try very hard, that random draw that we just saw sometimes doesn't give us what we want. That keeps things unknown. That gives us lots of uncertainty. Uncertainty is good because uncertainty helps create opportunity. If everything were buttoned down, if you could control your reality so much, that you knew everything that was going to happen next, you'd never grow up. There wouldn't be any challenges. You'd have everything just exactly the way you wanted it, when you wanted it, and how you wanted it. You'd be dead-ended. Reality wouldn't be any point, wouldn't be any good to you. It's good to you because there's uncertainty, because you have challenges, because you can't control it. So the system, it's not a flaw in the system that you don't get what you want. It's a feature of the system that no matter how hard you try, sometimes somebody will dump cold water on your parade because that's a lesson for you to learn, to grow up, to do something important. Example in medicine, let's say that the larger conscious system, according to the rule set, calculates that a lump forming on your neck is very probable. In other words, because of the biology, because of the rule set, it's probable now that there's going to be a lump on your neck for whatever reason. Now, the lump forms. There's a lot of uncertainty in the physical reality as to what the lump is. A lot of uncertainty. Okay, let's say now a doctor does a biopsy, takes a measurement. When he takes the measurement, there's a whole lot less uncertainty now, right? Okay, now let's say he does that and then 4 more doctors confirm his opinion. 4 more doctors take biopsies. Now we have 5 biopsies. Now there's even less uncertainty. And let's say out of those 5 biopsies, 4 of them indicate a 100% deadly tumor. All right, death is almost certain in, say, 2 months. Okay, now the uncertainty of the outcome is small, isn't it? But we started, before any of that was done, the uncertainty of the outcome was pretty large. You get to modify uncertainty with your intent. When should you have started working on this problem? After you got the 5 biopsies? Wrong time. You should have started working on this problem before you got the first one, right? Because that's where you have room to maneuver. That's where you can modify reality with your intent. Once that uncertainty starts to go away, now you're trying to change probability that's tough to change because there's not a whole lot of uncertainty left in it. There's not so much wiggle room. Left alone, the lump is going to progress just according to the probabilities. Let's say you didn't do anything. You got a lump. The rule set says that that's going to do. For some reason, there's something there, whatever, that creates the lump. The rule set says it's going to be there, and if you just don't do anything about it at all, the rule set will just keep doing whatever is most probable. And you may end up with that same deadly cancer because maybe that's where the rule set's taking you, or you may not. All right? So what about a doctor with a negative attitude? What about a doctor that says, oh, this lump is probably cancerous? Yeah, I felt something like that. They're always cancerous. Okay, you haven't had any biopsies yet, but your doctor's a pessimist, so he says that. Now, what's the probability that that lump's going to be cancerous? It just went up, didn't it? Because now you've got some negative intent, if you will, some negative energy pushing it toward the cancer as a solution. Now that probability is starting to move toward cancer. And it is with you too, because now you're terrified. You're afraid. You said, oh no, I got a deadly cancer. This is terrible. What am I going to do? And all your fear and the rest of it, you see, that just pushes it in that direction because your intent now is negative also. You think it's going to happen. If you think it's going to happen, you're moving that probability toward it happening. You see? Okay, you will find that the pessimistic doctor will have a higher percentage of cancerous tumors in his patients than the optimistic doctor. They've done many studies and they find that doctors with good bedside manner, that means that, really relate to their patients and are encouraging and give them information and talk to them, those doctors have a higher percentage of healthy patients. The doctors that have terrible bedside manner, their patients don't do as well. Why? Well, remember the placebo effect? Placebo effect is that if you're given the sugar pill and told that it's medicine, it often acts like medicine. You get better. Well, there's a reverse placebo effect. If you're told that this sugar pill is something that's going to hurt you, you're more likely to get ill from it, you see? So it works either way. You can move a probability to the positive side or to the negative side based on your intent and based on the intent of others. And let's say after you get all those biopsies, all your friends and neighbors know, oh, I've got this deadly tumor, 4 out of 5 say that. Now you've got 10 people all knowing this is horrible and miserable and terrible things to happen. Now you got 10 people who are feeding that probability of that tumor actually being cancerous when they open it up and operate on it and take it out and measure it finally, okay? So you see what's going on here? You need to be positive. The fear is the problem. It's the negative attitude that's the problem. The negative attitude of the doctor, the negative attitude of yourself, the idea that nothing I can do about it, and so on. Those are the problems. So that's just an example how that goes. Now we see that in all kinds of things where attitude affects the results. You've probably heard of studies where they they have school children and they're all just randomly distributed, just school children. All the classes are like any others, but they tell the teacher something different. They say, teachers, you've got the class of the smart kids. Teacher, you got the class of the dumb kids. And guess what happens? By the end of the semester, the teacher who was told they had the smart kids, her kids test better than the teacher who was told that they have the dumb kids. Why is that? See? Well, we now have some intent. Well, what is it about kids? Kids have about as much uncertainty as any entity on the planet, right? It's hard to tell what kids are going to turn out to be and how they're going to do and the way they're going to see life. There's lots of uncertainty there. They're easy to manipulate. They're easy to manipulate that way. So it's not that the one teacher treats her kids well and the other teacher ignores them. The teachers are both trying to do a good job, but you're starting to manipulate the outcome of the probabilities. And now if the teacher stands up and says, I've got all the dumb kids, you're the dumb kids. We don't expect a whole lot out of you, so we're going to do a little extra time in recess, and we're going to skip math. Well, now you have all the kids thinking that they're dumb. So now all the kids are moving that probability toward that. And by the time you're done, you can probably decrease the IQ of this group of kids by, 5 points and increase the IQ of those kids by 5 points or more, just because of the placebo effect, just because of what you tell them, just because of what they think, just because of the way you treat them, just because of what you expect out of them or don't expect out of them. So you see this mind thing, this attitude, it's what you think, how positive you are, has a lot to do with your reality, has a lot to do with what you run into. You ever know anybody who was just really negative about everything? Oh, woe is me, everything happens to me, my life sucks, and so on and so on. Most of those people, their life sucks, they're right, but they're creating that to a large extent. And if you ever run into people who are just up, they're just bubbly all the time, oh yeah, my mother just died, but she was ill for a long time, it was probably a good thing because she was suffering. And everything, they find the silver lining in every issue, they're always bubbly, they're always happy. They are happy. It's because everything's positive. Their life is good, you see? So you create your own reality in many ways. The big difference we have between the hard sciences and the social sciences is that the social sciences are soft because they have more uncertainty because they're dealing with people. Soft sciences are things like economics, psychology, sociology. They're dealing with people. People have a lot of uncertainty about them, about what they do and why they do it. And medicine is like that too. They're dealing with people. Well, in these soft sciences, what have they found? They have found that if you don't do your research double and triple blind, your research isn't worth a damn. Why not? Because depending on the attitudes of the researchers and the attitudes of the subjects, the results vary all over the place. If it's double and triple blind and nobody has a clue what's going on with who, then you eliminate some of the variables, you see. You're actually changing the outcome because of your expectation, just like the placebo effect changes your health because of your expectation of what your health is going to be. So we've already begun this idea of we have a larger reality and we're going to start to bifurcate it into, here's the hard sciences where there's very little uncertainty, therefore it is approximately objective. Therefore, the scientific method works because it works within that approximation. Okay, just like Newtonian physics is approximately correct in slow speeds and large distances. So that's where we're going. That's the result of this. We're seeing it already. The soft sciences have to take effect that the mind alters the result. Now, nobody likes to admit that that's what's going on, but that's obviously the case. It's just not objective. The placebo effect is just not an objective effect. what you tell a patient shouldn't have anything to do with whether that medicine works or not, or whether or not they get well or not, but it does. All right. Synchronicity and other anomalies. Uncertainty provides multiple solutions. Which solution you get depends on you, what solution do you encourage, and it depends upon which you pick out when you do these random draws of the possibilities within the distributions of the possibilities. As long as there are no conflicts in your reality frame, there's no data that is in conflict with this other data, then everything else is fair game. It's the sort of reality that you're in. So one of the examples I've used before that I think is fun is that you come home after a trip and you look in your refrigerator and there's no beer. And you're sure that there was 4 or 5 beer in that refrigerator. Okay, you were just sure of it. You've been gone for 2 weeks. You're sort of sure. But that's surprising. So what maybe happened here? Well, nobody really knows because you don't really remember. So when you open that refrigerator door, you're making a measurement. When you make a measurement, you're going to reach into the probability distribution and you're going to pull out something. And it's probably going to be somewhere around what you've measured because it's probably like that probability curve we saw on the bottom. It's probably kind of a big fat curve. It goes like that. And it's very unlikely it's going to be a case in there, and it's very unlikely that there's none. But you can open that door and you might get 3 or 4 or 0 or whatever because it's a statistical draw. You see? So any of those possibilities are the case. It's not an objective reality. Now, what happens if you took a camera just before you left, say, I'm going to make sure about this beer thing. They got me last time, but now this time I'm going to get them. So you open the refrigerator door, you take your camera, you take a picture, and you're right there. You can count them. When you come back, that's how many will be there because it's already come into this reality. It's a fact. There's the evidence, and it'll have to be exactly like that. That's that curve. They went like this, went straight up over F, remember, and came straight down and over the other side. There's no uncertainty. That's it. That electron gets measured going through a slit. That's it. There's no more uncertainty where that electron is. It's right there. So what can it do? Travel in a straight line. It's the only thing it can do anymore. See, so that's how the reality works. So why should the larger consciousness system create anomalies and synchronicities? You know, it can create a synchronicity in the fact that because there is this possibility for different choices, the larger consciousness system can say, all right, number of beer in the refrigerator, it really doesn't know. We'll just pick a 0 on that one. So the larger consciousness can on purpose give you a 0, and that doesn't conflict with anything that's known. There's no pictures. Your memory isn't all that good. You know. So it does. And why? Because it also makes you very thirsty and you head down to the neighborhood store to buy some more beer because it's been a long trip in the airport, you're dry, and while you get there at that store, you run into somebody that changes your life. You meet your soulmate, somebody gives you a better job, you know, something happens that changes your life, and you go, wow, that was synchronicity. I just happened to run out of beer when I thought I had some. I went to the store and wham, I ran into this guy. Well, yes, and can those things just be circumstantial? Yes. But can they also be manipulated? Yes. You see, that's possible. Within a system like this, the system itself can manipulate data as long as it doesn't break any of its own rules. It can manipulate that data. So that's where synchronicity comes from. It just says, well, so-and-so's gone to that store and, you know, these two ought to match up for some reason. That's kind of a good thing. It would give them both better opportunities to learn and grow. They'll get something out of it. So suddenly you open the door and there's no beer, you're thirsty, you go, you run into them. You see, the other person could be nudged too. So you just happen to run into each other. So things like that happen. We all kind of have a sense of that there's stuff that's set up, you know, in our life. Oh man, that was a setup. You know, I should have seen that coming. You know, how many of us have had that experience? Sure. That's because the system allows it. Doesn't mean the system always does it. It doesn't mean that every time something strange like that just falls in place for you, that that's what's going on. It may not be anything behind it other than that's just the way it worked out. But it's possible that it could be a nudged result. Okay, that's the synchronicity. Often these anomalies happen just for the reason to help wake you up. Remember, your evolution is its evolution. So the larger consciousness system would like for you to grow up. And one of the first steps in growing up is seeing that reality is bigger than just you. You are not the center of the universe, and that there's this bigger reality. That's like step one. And it can do that by opening up your mind a little bit to the fact that reality is bigger. There's something else out there, something bigger than you going on. And how can it do that? It does that with these little paranormal synchronicities, these abnormalities. It could be something trivial. It could be something very simple. You might, here's an example of that. You may be walking down in the grocery store and a thing of aspirin just falls off the shelf as you walk by and rolls out in front of your cart. And you look at it and you go, oh, well, we don't have any of that at home. I ought to get that. Gee, that was lucky. And you pick it up and you take it home, and that's a Saturday night. In the morning, Sunday, you get this terrible headache. And in the rural area where you live, there are no stores open. Oh, that was lucky that thing of aspirin rolled out right in front of my cart just when I needed it. Well, it's not that the larger conscious system is worried about your headache and wants to make you feel better. That's not the point. It's just a little, wake up. Don't you see what just happened here? Reality's bigger than you think. And that's why we get these things. Sometimes people will pick up a telephone and get a recorded message from their Uncle Fred who died 3 weeks before. And there it is, recorded on the message. Usually it freaks them out so much they erase the message right away because it scares them half to death. Well, that's good, isn't it? That's what they're supposed to do, is erase that message right away. Okay, the effect was had. It just woke them up. How could that happen? I heard it. You see, these are just little wake-up calls. That's why many of these things happen. All of you have probably had experiences like that are not objective. And mostly there's no evidence that anything really happened that was true, because that's the psi uncertainty principle. It always has to be plausible deniability to the rest of the world. It's just for you. You see, it's designed that way. There's a reason for it being that way. Okay. Another cartoon. Okay, now we're going to get in. We did this a little on Friday, the false appearance of backward causality. There's a whole lot of things that fall into this. There is no such thing as backward causality. The cause always has to precede the effect. What happens, let's talk about the patients, the hospital patients this time. Let's say we have 20,000 hospital patients, and this research was done many years ago. There's been a couple of books written about it, and it's been done several places. What happens is people get records, hospital records, out of the database, and these hospital records go back decades sometimes. These are all the people who have already been in the hospital or out. Right? The measurement's already been taken, just like that experiment we showed you. The measurement's already been taken. And they take the data and they break it up into various pieces, and for some of the pieces they use their focused intent to make those people healthier, to give them better health, that they wouldn't stay in the hospital very long. And the other group's just a control group. And they found out that they can actually make their subject group, as opposed to the control group, have statistically significant shorter hospital stays, even though the data is a decade old. But they can only do that within the natural uncertainty of the hospital stay data anyway. They can't make all those people get out in a day where everybody else was in for an average of 2 weeks. You see, that's too much. But they can make it, instead of 14 days, which is the average 2 weeks, they can make it just 12 days. See, that's enough. And the thing, again, that makes it significant is that they do this consistently. So if you had 20,000 patients and you mix them up randomly to make 20 groups of 1,000 each, then you can do 20 experiments, each with a group of 1,000 patients in it. And if all 20 of those experiments, the people get out of the hospital just 2 days sooner, well, now you've done the same as flipping a coin 20 times and getting a head every time or a tail every time. You see, now you've done something that's very, very hard to do. But each one has only been moved just a little bit within the uncertainty, within that one. Well, this is the sort of thing that has been done. And as we discussed on Friday, you can do this with random decays of a radioactive source in a Geiger counter, where you have 2 different counts. You let the Geiger counter count the source. You have a certain number of counts in this Geiger counter 1 and a certain number of counts in Geiger counter 2. You take the data and you can bias and make more counts in Geiger counter 1 than 2, which isn't as amazing because one of them is always going to have a little more than the other because it's not going to be perfectly even. But then you can always make Geiger counter 1 in every one of the experiments be the one that has a little more or the one that has a little less. Now you've done something amazing. Random number generators. You can do the same thing with sets of random numbers. And what's going on here is that you're not affecting the health of these people that were in the hospital. That's done. Whatever happened to them happened to them. You're affecting the results of the data that has never been looked at, that's still in the future. See, nobody analyzed that data and said, what was the average stay of these patients? What was the average stay of each group? So now let's look at that a little bit. Had somebody looked at the whole 20,000 and said, what was the average stay for the 20,000? Then what you'd have to have when you broke it up into 20, by the time you summed all that data across all 20 of those, you'd still have to have that same average for all of them, wouldn't you? But you wouldn't have any constraint at all for each individual set. So you still have to meet the data that's here, but there's still uncertainty. Now what happens if you had those 2 groups of 1,000? Let's say you had a group of 1,000 and you're going to break it into 2 groups of 500, let's say. In those 2 groups of 500, you're going to make this 500 get out early, this 500 get out late. Oh, that wouldn't be nice. This 500 we wouldn't change, and that 500 we get out early, right? We don't want to make anybody get out late. So you're going to do this, and let's say that before you do it, you take the average hospital stay of that group of 1,000 before you break it into 2 groups of 500. Okay, now you apply your mind to it, and what happens? Can you move it? Yes, you can, but if you move one side off the average to the positive, say to the shorter stay, the other side has to move off the average to the negative, say exactly the same amount, because you already know what the average was of the whole group. So now your results would they'd have to move this way, right, to keep it even, because you have data in the reality of what the result was for all 1,000. See how that would work? And if you broke the groups into 2 of 500, and then you did what the average was of each of the group of 500, and you know that, and now you try to bias one of the 500 using your intent, you can't do it. You already know what the result is. You can't change it. The result's already in this reality. If you were to change it, that would be a conflict. The reality wouldn't be consistent anymore. Can't be done then. It's fixed. It's done. It's over. So backwards causality isn't changing the experience anyone had in the hospital. And the people who do these experiments are confused by that. And you'll see, I'll read a little thing a little later, and they believe that they've actually changed the health of the people that got out of the hospital, but that's impossible because that's already done. They've already been out of the hospital. You see, so then there's this big mystery. How did we do that? It's reverse causality. It's a great big mystery. There isn't any reverse causality. They've just modified the data. The error in their thinking is that the data has to represent what happened. That's the problem. Okay. So the same logic that derives quantum mechanics derives things like talking to your plants, creating a parking place in a busy lot, intent-based, power of positive thinking, law of attraction. All of those things are based on the same principle of you can modify the future probabilities with your intent. The passage of time often adds uncertainty. Objective proof dissipates. Old records, people forget, trying to remember how many beer in the refrigerator 2 weeks later rather than a day later. As time goes on, uncertainty grows. As uncertainty grows, the possible solutions grow too. You see, the results, the way things could come out starts to become more flexible, the more uncertainty there is. Summary and results. I'll just read through these quickly. This is kind of just a recap. Modeling consciousness as a self-modifying digital information system evolves towards states of lower entropy, right? We know that. Physical reality is a virtual reality, subset of the larger consciousness system. It's there to help budding individuated units of consciousness called an entity evolve through experience. Our virtual reality begins as a future probable distribution and remains that way until a measurement is made to the data is needed. And that defines our reality like any other. We get up and look at our window at that tree in the park. That's when we make the measurement and need the data, and that's when we get it in our data stream. Okay. The result is that physics and metaphysics become part of one logical theory and are unified. Eastern philosophy, theology have been integrated with science. Love and spirituality are both defined in terms of entropy, the measurable quantity. The result is that normal and paranormal are the same. It's all just normal. The result is that we have derived the fundamental purpose of existence in general and our existence in particular to evolve towards lower entropy states. Time, relativity, quantum mechanics have been derived from one overarching fundamental theory with just two assumptions: the measurement problem and the invariant velocity of light. That little toe information has all been solved now. Additionally, the appearance of backward causality problem, the research that Pear Labs does on these same sorts of things, of mind affecting matter, they've all been solved. We understand how they work. Synchronicity, mind-matter scientific anomalies have been explained. Lowering entropy increases the information available to the evolving entropy. As you lower your entropy, your decision space grows, your reality grows, the information you have access to grows, your potential grows, your opportunities grow, and you grow, you see. Okay, the larger consciousness system is an aware, evolving system. It's real and therefore finite. I have a lot of people that fumble over this finite thing. They say, finite, how can it be finite? Larger consciousness system has to be infinite. Well, there is no thing that's real that's infinite. Infinity is just an abstraction. It never exists. Nothing real can be infinite. Okay, infinite systems require infinite energy. Anytime you get to infinite, you can always add something to it, and now you get bigger than infinite, and that's not allowed. So any real system has to be a finite system. If it's a finite system, it has to have a boundary. If it has a boundary, there has to be something outside of it. That was that chart we had, that there's some things you just don't know. Okay, it's big. It seems infinite. From our perspective, it would appear to be infinite. If we were in an inner tube in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that ocean would look infinite to us. It would look the same in every direction, and days would go by, and it would never change. It would look infinite, but it's not. It's just big, big relative to us. Okay, there's consciousness, and then there is consciousness. I'm going to define, there's a little c, or local consciousness, which is the view as seen by the free will awareness unit. Your personal consciousness is a subset of the larger consciousness system, constrained within a VR by one, the consequences of the rule set that define the VR, and by the quality of the hosting, IUOC. That's what you come to it with. What do you bring? Your history, your growth, your evolution. Little c consciousness is caused by the data generated by big C consciousness, and it's interpreted by the subset of that big C consciousness called the free will awareness unit. So now we have a big C, the big consciousness system, and a little c, which is that part of that big consciousness system that's just dedicated to your experience here. Okay, we're going to talk about brains. This is, hopefully we're getting close to the end here before we do some of the fun stuff. We talked about the brain as a part of the body is the constraint on your ability here, because it keeps you constrained to act and interact only within the rule set, because your brain is a product of the rule set. It's part of the evolved virtual reality that represents the rule set. The rule set is how it evolved to this, right? That's how the energy turned into this universe and turned into our planet, and we're part of this big digital bang. Okay, so your brain doesn't actually store any data. It doesn't process any data. It doesn't think, it doesn't exist. It's a virtual brain. All that activity that you attribute to your brain is going on in this little c consciousness. That's your consciousness. It's part of the larger consciousness system. Your consciousness thinks. Your consciousness stores data. Your consciousness does all this, and it's limited by this thing called a brain. It can't do any more than that brain can do, because that brain is a representative of the rule set, which restricts what it can do in this virtual reality built with that rule set. Okay, so that's basically the way it works. Anyway, let's go into a better brain metaphor. Just want to define some terms. It helps if we have a lexicon. It helps if we have concepts and terms that we can use to talk about these things. Okay, there's a file with your name on it that separates your experience of a virtual physical reality from the larger consciousness system. Okay, that file is or partition subset of big C consciousness. It's called a free will awareness unit, and that is what you identify as you, the player in this virtual reality. That's your little C consciousness, your local awareness. Okay, now, so this free will awareness unit is a collection of data, memory, rules, and processing that interprets the data stream, defining experience within the virtual physical reality. It also makes choices. It has free will. The free will awareness unit generates new experience that's collected and integrated with past experiences within an individuated unit of consciousness. So big C consciousness generates the data stream that the free will awareness unit interprets. Remember, you are real consciousness pretending to be a virtual body. The body and brain is a set of constraints that represent the result of VR evolution under the rule set. The free will awareness unit experience constrained to what the rule set allows at this particular point in your evolution. The virtual brain is not a source, repository, or processor of information. It's only a constraint upon the source, storage, and processing of the information. Okay, now the virtual brain has to be capable of storing and processing, gazillion gigabytes of information. It has to be capable of that, or your consciousness wouldn't be allowed to do that. But that doesn't mean that you actually have that brain. Two kinds of change. Gain or lose capabilities as a result of choice. One way to do that is from the perspective of consciousness. The consciousness always leads and the body follows. Okay, a changed consciousness produces a modified brain to support those changes. As you grow up, as you change and your consciousness change, the brain will change to support that. Okay? There was, you see this thing of a kind of odd sheep morality, but there was an article I read on the internet that these scientists looked at these sheep and noticed that the sheep were actually moral creatures, because if a sheep was killed and its lamb was still in the suckling stage, some other mother sheep would take it on, allow it to suckle and raise the lamb as her own. And they said, well, gee, that doesn't look like survival of the fittest here. That mother is sharing her resources with somebody else's genetic material. Why are they doing that? Well, that's a moral thing to do. Gee, these sheep have moral, they're moral animals. Well, that was a big surprise. Only humans can do that, right? Well, here these sheep are moral animals. Of course, so are dogs and cats, and lots of critters are moral animals. But anyway, this was big news to these scientists. So they, of course, killed those moral sheep, because that's what you do if you're a scientist. And they looked at their brains and they said, well, here, look, this is the reason for that morality. They have this part of their brain developed that is the same kind of part of the brain that humans have. Their moral activity comes from this piece of the brain, and this sheep shows that it's got a nodule there. That part of the brain has that same place for moral activity. Therefore, because the brain developed this little nodule that hosts moral development, moral activity, therefore the sheep were able to act morally. But you see, that's just backwards. What happened was that the sheep evolved to be caring, to become moral. And when they did that, their brain changed to have that little nodule that supported that fact. You see, so the mind leads and the body follows. That's how we bootstrap ourselves forward or backward, by our choices. We actually change our physiology to some extent when we learn and grow, or when we sink backwards into de-evolution. We physically change, so we create a hole for ourselves. If we de-evolve through fear and ego, we actually change ourselves physically. Our brain changes to represent that. And now we have to turn around and come back. We've got to rechange it. So this is number one way to gain or lose, is that consciousness leads and the body follows. That's the same with the placebo effect, right? Consciousness leads and the body follows. It's the same sort of thing. Okay, the other way is you can gain or lose capabilities as a result of the rule set. And this is just the opposite then. From the physical perspective, the body leads and the consciousness follows. Okay, and that is that the brain becomes physically damaged. So the body leads in the sense that somebody hits you over the head with a steel pipe. It bashes part of your brain gets some bleeds, loses oxygen, part of your brain dies in a brain injury, and now you have additional limits, things you can't do that you used to be able to do. Okay? So in that case, the brain was damaged, and the consciousness system that has to abide by the rule set now is limited into what it can do because its constraints just got bigger, you see? But now that's just the little c consciousness. That's just the little c consciousness that's in the game, that's playing this character. The big C consciousness, the individuated unit of consciousness, it didn't hurt that any. The fact that the person had brain damage or got Alzheimer's, their consciousness doesn't get hurt by any of that, obviously. That's just what happens here in this local virtual reality game. That's just the storyline here. So it's not affected. Only little c consciousness is affected by that. It's probably worth talking about, so what about terrible experiences, fear, ego, things that drive you to more fear? Those experiences, what will they do? Well, they will actually change your brain to where it affects you, it makes you different. And we know that. Anybody who's been around a child, say, who had a very traumatic experience, say a child was walking in a park with his family and a mugger comes out and killed both his parents right in front of him, some kind of a brutal thing. That child is different now. So now let's lighten that up a little bit. And let's say on the other end of the thing, you go to a horror movie. And in that horror movie, you're terrified and you scream and you do all sorts of things and you're emotionally connected to that. That horror movie can do some brain damage to you. It can raise the level of fear in your life. You go out of that movie and you start looking behind bushes and jumping when you hear squeaks. You see, now you've raised the level of fear. You've just de-evolved a little bit. Same with playing violent video games, watching violent TV. But on the other hand, it only affects you in as much as you attach to it. Now, if you watched that horror movie and you thought it was funny, it's always like that, the dumb music and the hand comes out from behind the door and it makes you laugh because it's ridiculous, then that's not going to affect you, you see? You haven't connected to the fear. So it's not just that violent video games are going to, ruin your life or your child's life. They may not affect your child at all if they don't connect to the violence, if they don't connect to the fear, you see? If they do connect to the fear, then yes, it can be damaging. Same with movies, same with anything. It would even be the same with that little child that saw its parents killed. If it didn't really connect to what was going on, then, it didn't, it wouldn't have that big of an effect on it. So we can de-evolve ourselves several ways. We can do it just by a terrible experience. It just happens to us, like the child in the park. We can do it with our imagination. My son, when he was a toddler, just staggering around, barely able to stay on his feet, fell down at a friend's house. And the friend had a big dog. And the big dog was a very friendly big dog. And when he fell down and rolled over on his back, this big dog walked up and stood over him and looked at him like, "Kid, you having a problem?" Well, my son was terrified because there was this huge dog standing over him. The dog probably weighed 4 times what he did, and he saw this big dog with those big teeth, looking down at him, and he screamed and was terrified. We picked him up, and he was afraid of dogs after that. That made him afraid of dogs. Well, that dog didn't threaten him. You see, there was nothing actually threatening at all in the situation, but he imagined that it was threatening. You can de-evolve by what you imagine, besides what you experience. Your belief, fearful attitudes, religion, propaganda, conspiracy theorists, whatever it is. If it's drumming up fear, that can push you in the wrong direction. You can de-evolve because you watch the nightly news too often. It's a little joke. Choice in the movies you go to, you can do it by your choice. So that's by experience, by imagination, because of your beliefs, or because of your choices. All of those things are ways that you can stoke your fear. All right. So I'm going to read through these really, really quick. There is no physical body or brain, just a computed simulation, virtual body brain that functions, defines constraints according to the simulation's rule set. The properties of the simulated virtual body and brain provide the constraints that limit how a free will awareness unit can express itself within a virtual reality. It does that by limiting expression to what can be naturally supported by the physical evolution, electrochemical, mechanical requirements of body and brain according to the rule set. The part of consciousness that interprets the data stream, that's you, the physical reality VR player, is contained in a file with your name on it called a free will awareness unit, which is contained within a folder of your cumulative experience. That cumulative experience is your individuated unit of consciousness, and the free will awareness unit is in constant communication with that IOC. Okay, that just kind of defines some terms. So we know that the WoW character, the World of Warcraft character running around in a computer screen, he has no direct line to the sender. You don't have that World of Warcraft person saying, oh, you know, I need to get a download from the server. You know, when you're the character in the game, it's not that your brain, see, we have this idea that consciousness downloads information to our brain, right? And there's some kind, it's like a comm line, okay? Our higher self has a comm line down to our brain. Well, it's not like that. There is no comm line. There is no brain. It's just virtual, okay? You are one with the server. You're in the server. You get the direct connection. It doesn't have to come to your physical brain. That doesn't exist. Virtual brain and virtual body are just data. Limitations. Well, I think we've already talked about that. You can't do any more than your brain will allow your consciousness to do. Your body can't do any more than the rule set allows, you know, your body to do. You can't jump 20 feet in the air because the rule set says you're not designed that way. Therefore, your consciousness cannot experience that. The experience of the consciousness, the data stream to the consciousness has to abide by the rule set. All right. When the brain dies, the free will awareness unit dissolves and is deleted, but it's been backed up continuously. You might say it's mirrored by the IUOC, the collection of data, rules, quality, memory, experience that define the larger you. That's the higher self, oversoul, whatever you call it. It remains in the larger consciousness system as a data folder, and you've just added a bunch of data to it from your experience here. You see, so that's how that works. And that continues like that until the larger consciousness system again partitions off some new portion of itself to define a new player in the physical reality game to be constrained by a selection of information representing a given IUOC. Constrained again by the VR rule set, constrained again by what that data set brings to the table. Okay, what you've gained, how much you've learned. You start all over as a newbie, and you have to learn all over again how to interpret that data as an infant. Okay, yet it retains the potential that reflects your consciousness quality. So that's how that works. Okay, now all of these things, the IUOC, the free will awareness unit, you know, the larger consciousness system, all these words and terms, don't take them too seriously. They're just metaphors. They're ways of pigeonholing certain concepts of the data so that we can talk about it. Don't have all these little things sitting on sticks, you know, stuck up off the larger consciousness system. It's all just one consciousness system. We're all one. It's just one thing. But we break it into pieces so we can talk about it. All right. Graphics lag. You know, if you're in a video game, the one thing that is the bane of all virtual realities is video lag. What video lag is you're playing your World of Warcraft, and you're in this big battle, and suddenly you're moving your mouse and you're clicking your button, and your character just stands there, and he doesn't do anything. That's video lag. What happens is that the server that's doing the game is going right on processing, and you, like a dumb, you're just sitting there, you're not doing anything because the data hasn't made it to you yet, because you are two things that are both bad. You are slow compared to that server. Your network and your computer is slow, and you are last in line. The server calculates it. The players get it, goes out on the comm line on the internet and travels halfway around the world and finally gets to you. You're the last one in line, and then all your stuff is slow. So you get video lag. That's the problem. Well, in the consciousness system, in this virtual reality, we have a problem with video lag. Okay, we have that same problem. But there's only one thing we can do about it. Now in the world of Warcraft, you can do one thing about it, and that is you can get your equipment to be faster. You could get a faster network, and you could get faster, video card. That would help, but you're still last in line. Consciousness is just the opposite. We can't speed up what's slow. And what is slow? It's us. It's these muscles, electromechanical things, you see, that have to respond to the data. How long does it take you to raise an arm? I mean, that's forever if you talk about the speed that computers work at, right? It's really slow. So it's these old electrical, mechanical bodies and brains with little electrical signals being sent around, and all that takes time. So we're what's slow. And we can't change that. We're stuck with that because that's the rule set. But it doesn't have to be last in line. We can move that up, you see. And research began finding the facts that this had been moved up, that we start moving and responding our system, our physical system, before we ever get the stimulus to move or respond. Okay? And science now has found this in probably half a dozen different places. And what's going on here, well, let me talk about some of them here. What we found is that in the 1983, I think is maybe when some of it started, a German physiologist found something they called the Breitschaft's potential. Breitschaft means readiness potential, okay? What that meant was they found that if there was a stimulus to move, when you hear the bell, raise your right hand. That's a stimulus to move. What they found out was that there were potentials deep in the muscles, tiny little things that you could only measure with extremely sensitive equipment that saw the muscle getting ready to move before the bell rang. So you would anticipate the motion. Okay, now they made a very poor conclusion from all that. They decided at that time that that meant that there was no free will. Because obviously, if the body starts to move before the consciousness is even aware that it's supposed to move, you see, then where's the free will? We're just robots. Well, that's because they didn't understand consciousness. They had no idea that there was a big C consciousness, a little C consciousness, and how all this was connected. So that was back in the 83. There was a big thing in science that obviously there was no free will. We live in a deterministic reality, and that's nonsense. Other people then started looking at the same sorts of things, and there's a whole set of experiments where you anticipate what's going to happen, and it's usually a physical interpretation. Okay, the empathy is another one. If they would get two people who were connected in some way, maybe they were siblings or maybe they were just good friends or whatever, you had two people and they were connected in some way, and you'd put one in this room and one in that room, and the one in that room you'd wire up with all this very, very sensitive equipment, and the one in this room, you'd show them pictures of things, or you'd threaten them, or you'd do some kinds of things to them, and you'd find out that the one in the other room would actually have an empathetic reaction to it before you ever showed that one the picture. See, a reaction before. So it was amazing enough that they had the empathetic reaction without even knowing what was going on, and secondly, they'd have it ahead of the problem happening. Well, how many parents do you know who just happen to know that their child's in trouble? That happens all the time. There's these empathetic reactions going on, and often it happens, ahead of time. Well, that's because they're getting into the future probable reality. But anyway, this was the Breitschaft's thing, and they found it in any number of experiments with people having a reaction before the stimulus occurred. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is that we have this video lag in our virtual reality because our electrochemical, mechanical systems are so slow compared to our consciousness, which is going like a very fast computer. So we need to get them started. So we go first in line is we get the, we have the future probable reality. Then because of that future probability, we say, okay, body, give you a head start. get moving based on a future probability. Because you're so slow, we need to get you going ahead of time. So then the body starts going based on a future probability, and then when the happening happens, it's already, these slow systems are already kind of geared up so it makes it seem not quite so bad video lag. Now, that's the way the system seems to work. There was lots of these going on. There's a whole bunch of anticipation of future events going on, some of them physical, some of them not. Dean Radin did a bunch of studies of bodies reacting to calm or disturbing pictures. And again, he had their bodies wired up, and the bodies were wired up for very subtle electrochemical changes. And he would have a computer randomly pick a picture, and the pictures were either sweet and wonderful or they were horrific, death and destruction, terrible pictures. And he would find that seconds before the random computer ever picked the picture, the person would start to react to it. And it's sort of like that double slit experiment, isn't it? You see, it's not supposed to happen, though. It doesn't happen in objective reality. And they were just getting started because an emotional reaction is a very complex electrochemical thing. You have to have glands that secrete things, which get into the blood, which transfers to the brain, which transfers signals to the muscles. All that is slow. So all that started before the actual stimulus started. The empathy at a distance was done before the fact. Precognitive dreams are commonly experienced. Well, the thing is, you get a probable reality database, allows anticipation of future events, and you also have network communications. We're all communicating with each other. We're all netted. Okay, so that happens. Oh, and besides, I should have told you, all the words in italics here, those are not mine. I copied those from a report that I got sent to me actually in an email, from a list posted by a Dr. Craig Hogan, and he put together a list of, quote, unexplainable, repeatable, well-documented scientific experiments. This was the list of, these are the strange things like the double slit experiment that we know happen. Okay, so these are not my things. Okay, anticipation of future events, another slide. There was an analysis here. We're talking about a huge analysis with thousands, 50,000 subjects and so on, and it showed that people are able to predict what will be shown at levels that exceed those expected by chance. Okay, so it's the same sort of thing. Then there was reverse causality. Now remember, these are his words, not mine. And listen how he phrases this. Retro-intention studies, that's reverse causality, showing that intentions somehow has an effect on an experimental group of cardiac intensive care patients that were in treatment 9 years previous to the healing. Well, see, he's confused. It doesn't somehow have an effect on. There's no effect on those patients. It's just the data. Do you see? So even the people that do this research have no idea of why this is happening. It's just a big mystery, like the double slit experiment. Okay, leading intention, it clicks on Geiger counters recorded at one time can be influenced by consciousness years later. The Geiger counter isn't influenced by consciousness years later. The data is. What happened with the Geiger counter is done. If you believe that the data that was taken has to represent exactly what the Geiger counters did, that's an objective belief. It's not true. Machines can affect energy and so on. Okay, it's a scientific belief that in an objective and deterministic world, that Geiger counters must always be perfectly causally connected to the data they produce. That sounds normal, but not in a probabilistic statistical reality. Okay, a physical explanation of artifacts of consciousness always fails. Every time somebody's tried to make a psi event a function of the brain, it doesn't work. The fact that remote viewers and people in telepathy experiments in Faraday cages shielded from all electromagnetic energy aren't affected at all. They can work just as well. So every time they've tried to shield or interfere with psi effects by physical means, it doesn't work. Okay, so this comes to what's the value of a theory? Well, it's not that it supports current scientific beliefs. Of course, within academia, that's debatable, but it's not supposed to be because it supports current scientific beliefs. Basically, this theory is very much, as I said before, like Darwin's. The start is an assumption, but it fits all the data, explains all the research, explains all the anomalies. So what have we done? It solves things like physics, speed of light, quantum mechanics, paired labs, all those things, all these things we just went through, the right shaft potential and so on, metaphysics and philosophy, why we're here, what's our purpose, what happens after we die, nature of existence, free will, moral code, how does synchronicity work, how does one account for paranormal happenings, theology, okay? You know, I have a lot of people ask me about theology. They say, well, is the larger consciousness system God? You know, is there a connection there? Is that larger consciousness, is that God? And I tend not to use the God word because that means something different to everybody that uses it. You see, because it just starts an argument because all of us have our own metaphors, our own ideas of what that means. So it's a good thing if you're talking to a very, you know, to a heterogeneous group that you don't use words that are misunderstood or everybody understands them differently. So I just say larger consciousness system, but look at the way it works. We have a larger consciousness system, and it is more or less omniscient, is it not? It has all the data. It wants to help us grow and learn. It's positive for our help and our growth. It is our creator in the sense that it's virtual reality. We have these virtual bodies as far as us being in this virtual reality, right? And we are pieces of it as consciousness. You know, like the Buddha said, we're all one. Okay, so if you go through all these things, you can find an awful lot of theology that just falls right out that way. But I'd still rather not use the God word because it's just confusing and starts arguments and there's no point. But the larger consciousness system, if you're interested in theology, not from my dogma is better than your dogma, but back from the fundamentals of theology, which is there something else, you know, greater than ourselves? And if so, how do we relate to it? That's the real central questions to theology. Yes, it does. It solves those theology problems as well. So here we have, you know, physics and theology all falling out of the same understanding. Okay, so now we know what Lao Tzu and the Buddha were talking about, why some people are happy and some aren't. The ones that are happy are the ones that are growing, becoming love. The ones that aren't are the ones that are failing, that they're de-evolving. We know the difference between right and wrong, morals, ethics, what's important, what's not. What's important is what helps the system lower its entropy. What's not is what doesn't. How sometimes we know the unknowable, like Dean Radin's experiments, J.B. Ryan at Duke, remote viewing research at SRI, all those experiments are all nobody knows how they work. Well, now we do. Reincarnation, what happens after you die? Well, reincarnation is part of the plan because you can't do it all in one. It's a cumulative effect. Dr. Fredkin, when he came up with digital physics, and somebody said, well, where does the simulation come from? And he said, other. He didn't know, so he just put quotes around it, his word, and he said, other, someplace else other than this reality. Well, what's other? Consciousness. Consciousness is the computer, you see. You know, the failure of science to find consciousness in the brain or limit the effects of consciousness by physical means, well, of course not. It's all non-physical. You can't limit the non-physical by physical means. The theory makes many clear predictions that can be experimentally verified. Okay, so that's basically what you have, and that kind of ends our theory, and I'd like to take a break, and then we're going to come back and we have some time to do some experiential exercises, and we're going to talk about some remote viewing and some healing and that sort of thing.